Good morning, Rocketeers. I'm excited to get back to learning after spring break, and I'm really excited to get us started with a new book today that has a very interesting genre that I don't know if we've read much of this year. Um, but the book's name is Cinderella. I know many of you have probably heard of the Cinderella story before. So I'm going to ask you, just as we start reading this book, what kind of book do you think this is? What genre is it? And why do you think that? So when we're doing that, we're going to look at the front cover and kind of notice some things. Um, I do notice that there is not an author of this book. It says it's retold. And I noticed that the illustrator's name is James Marshall. I see drawings, and I see kind of like a silly looking person on the front cover, and she's holding a lot of dishes. It doesn't look very real to me. Um, but you might want to say it's a fiction book, and it is, but it has sort of a subgenre, which is called a fairy tale. And I know it's a fairy tale. I've heard this story before. Also, many times fairy tales will start with once upon a time, or happily ever after will come towards the end of the text. And that's kind of some things that will show us that it is a fairy tale, along with some other little whimsical things that you'll see as I'm reading the book. But there are still story elements to think about as we're reading the text, and I want you to really think about the S-T-O-R-Y as I'm reading. I'm not going to stop and sing the song because the book is a little bit long, and I know we're getting antsy. So before I even start reading, get some wiggles out, shake your hands, roll your shoulders. Okay, let's get ready. So again, the book's name is Cinderella. It's retold by Barbara Carlin, illustrated by James Marshall. Remember, think about the story elements, the S-T-O-R-Y, and also I want you to really pay attention to the character traits of our main characters in this story. Those are going to be the things that I put in our Google Doc for questions today. So pay attention to the S-T-O-R-Y, and pay attention to what the characters are like on the inside and how they might be very different. Our characters have some very opposing character traits. So let's go ahead and start reading. James Marshall's Cinderella. Once there was a widower with a kind and beautiful daughter. Life was sweet in their simple cottage until the widower decided to remarry. I love this picture, Rocketeers, and I think my favorite thing about it is this little dog. Not knowing the ways of the world, he married a vain and horrid woman, whose two daughters were as vain as horrid and as horrid as she. What a stupid little house, they said. The widower's daughter was made to work like a servant in her own house. She was soon run ragged, washing, ironing, scrubbing, dusting, and cooking heaps of food. The poor girl no longer had a bed of her own, and had to sleep among the ashes and cinders, and from that time on they called her Cinderella. Now it happened that the king of the land had a handsome son. The king's greatest desire was to see his son get married. He decided to give a ball and invite all the fair maidens of the realm. Here we see the king, he's kind of doing his face. He's most likely looking at his son, the prince. When the king's messenger delivered the royal invitation, the dreadful stepsisters were overjoyed. Each was convinced that she would win the prince's favor. On the day of the ball, Cinderella was exhausted from trying to make her stepsisters look beautiful. Wouldn't you like to go to the ball? They said, teasing her cruelly. Oh, yes, said Cinderella. Don't be ridiculous, said the stepsisters. What would a wretched mouse like you do at a fancy ball? And they shrieked with laughter. Remember, Rocketeers, when we think about character traits, we really pay attention to what the characters are saying. We pay attention to what they're doing, and we pay attention to what they're thinking. But I'm looking at what these characters are saying here, and I'm already getting an idea of a character trait that would describe the stepsisters of Cinderella. Ooh, here we go. They're getting ready for the ball. We see Cinderella down here sewing a dress. And here we see the stepsisters leaving the house. You see poor Cinderella up here. Thinking themselves beautiful beyond words, the stepsisters left for the ball. "Don't be a lazy bones while we're away," they said to Cinderella, "and think about all the fun we'll be having." After her stepsisters had gone, Cinderella went about her chores. As she worked, she wept bitterly. "You look so miserable, child," said a kind voice. Who do we think this new character is? I know many of you know. Think about it. "Who are you?" said Cinderella. "I," replied the plump little woman, "I am your fairy godmother. Please tell me why you are crying." "I want so much to go to the ball," said Cinderella. "That should not be too difficult to arrange," said the fairy godmother. "But you must do as I say. First, fetch me a nice big pumpkin from the garden." Cinderella brought the biggest pumpkin she could find. "Now," said the fairy godmother, "I will require 6 white mice and a fine fat rat." Cinderella brought them live from the trap. "And finally," said the fairy godmother, "I must have 2 lizards. You might look behind the watering pail." Cinderella did as she was told. Here we see the mice, we see the rat, we see the giant pumpkin, the 2 lizards. I don't remember that part of the story. With a touch of her wand, the fairy godmother changed the pumpkin into a magnificent golden coach, the mice into 6 white horses, the rat into a jolly coachman, and the lizards into 2 sleek footmen. "Lovely," the fairy godmother explained. "Off you go." "Am I to go in rags?" said Cinderella. "Silly me," said the fairy godmother. And she transformed Cinderella's filthy rags into an elegant gown, and on her feet placed a pair of sparkling glass slippers. "Now you are ready," said the fairy godmother. "But remember this, you must return home before the stroke of midnight, for then all your finery will change back to what it was." Cinderella promised to obey, and then she was off to the ball. Wow, so there's all the magical things. What was the rule she had to follow? I already forgot. Think about it, Rocketeers. What was the rule she had to follow? Oh, go back before midnight. Let's see. At the palace, the prince learned that an enchanting maiden had arrived, and he greeted her himself. The other guests were puzzled. Who was this beautiful stranger? You can tell how the stepsisters are feeling about this new stranger. Completely smitten, the prince had eyes for only Cinderella, and they danced every dance. Cinderella found herself deeply in love. She was so happy that she took no notice of the hour. Suddenly, the clock began to strike 12. Remembering the warning, Cinderella ran from the prince's arms, out of the ballroom and down the steps of the palace. In her haste, she lost one of the glass slippers. "Wait, wait," cried the prince. "I don't know your name." Cinderella's golden coach sped away from the palace, but at the stroke of 12, the fairy godmother's warning came true. The coach was changed back into a pumpkin, the horses back into mice, the coachman back into a rat, and the footmen back into lizards. Cinderella was once again dressed in rags. Second prince. Close that. So sorry. So sorry. Let me open that again. I'm so sorry, guys. Here we go. Sorry about that. So she's back in rags. Discovering the tiny glass slipper, the prince vowed to find and marry the beautiful stranger. He traveled the kingdom far and wide, trying the slipper on every maiden's foot, but it fit no one. Finally, he arrived at Cinderella's house. Me first, cried the elder stepsister, extending her long, skinny foot. But she could only manage to get her toes into the slipper. My turn, cried the younger sister, thrusting her pudgy foot at the prince. She pushed and shoved and grunted and groaned, but the slipper would not fit. May I try it on? Said Cinderella, stepping out of the shadows. Here we see the shoe fits. The glass slipper fit perfectly on Cinderella's tiny foot. I have found my princess, cried the prince. We shall wed tomorrow. On that festive day, the kingdom rejoiced. Generous and forgiving, Cinderella moved her family into the palace and found a lord of the court for each of her stepsisters to marry. I see two character traits here about Cinderella, and we also see her actions that are telling us so many things about her. Um, Not only does she forgive her stepsisters, but she goes, you can come live with me at the palace, and here you can find a husband here too. So we know that Cinderella has a really good positive character trait about her. Cinderella's fairy godmother moved in too, just to make sure everyone lived happily ever after. So that's the end of our book, friends. I'm sorry about the little interruption there at the end, but I am going to be posting some questions in the Google Doc. So make sure after you watch this video that you click on the Google link and you answer my questions. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, guys.